All right, so this is part two. Well, or it's part three, I'm not really sure. If it is part three, I think I've abandoned that project and it's just going to be part two. And then at some point there might be a part three, but we'll just see how this goes. And like if we were watching a TV show, I'm going to start with a flashback. So when last we left off, previously on the Austin School, we had gotten into what Reagan was doing to transform the United States. And we'd even gotten into Bush a little bit, Bush Senior. So what I want to do now, though, is I want to jump back for a moment and re-examine Nixon. Because Nixon is really the proto-Reagan. Had Nixon not gone down in a ball of flames because of Watergate, he would have probably advanced the cause that Reagan will then pick up later. In other words, Nixon was a necessary component in making. So we got to start with his election, because his election also sets the tone. In 1968, the Democratic Party is in chaos. It's in chaos in large measure because the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In 1964, LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act. The Democrats have made civil rights a priority, and a group of southern states have gone into an active rebellion. 1964, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina vote Republican. In 1860, those states left the Union because a Republican was elected president. So here we are, 104 years later, and those states that hated the Republicans so much, they triggered the Civil War, are voting Republican. And they're doing it because on civil rights, the two parties are switching places. It's not the two parties switch places, but on civil rights they are. That is accurate. And so the South does an act of rebellion to teach the Democrats a lesson for backing civil rights. 4 years later, the South isn't done. The South is still furious. The South is angry. And the way the South is going to manifest this is the governor of Alabama, George Cornwallis, is going to run for president as a Dixiecrat. Now, this is a really, because what he's trying to do is first punish the Democrats for civil rights, even though he himself is a Democrat. And then second, he's hoping that he'll deprive both candidates of a majority of electoral college delegates. The Constitution says, in the event, that no candidate gets a majority of electoral college delegates, not a majority of popular votes. You could get a relatively small minority of popular votes as long as you get the majority of electoral college delegates. That's the only thing that matters. He's hoping both candidates won't get it. In that case, it then goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives votes 1 vote per state. So there's literally 50 votes. And so what the delegations do is they themselves pick a candidate, and they say the state of Texas votes for, and then fill in the name. And what he's hoping is, if that happens, he'll win the South. And then a few other states, and the rest of the states will be divided between Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, and somehow he'll eke out a victory in the House. It's a long shot. It's unlikely, but he's the last third-party candidate to win electoral college delegates. He won Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Arkansas. So it was the exact same thing that happened. South Carolina didn't go for him, but Arkansas did. The reason that matters is it does two things. It steals popular votes away from Hubert Humphrey, and it steals electoral college delegates away from Hubert Humphrey. Those electoral college delegates were solidly Democratic. Nixon wins the 1968 election by a large margin in electoral college delegates. 0.7% of the popular votes. So that's one reason why Nixon wins the 1968 election. When you think about it, it should have been impossible for Nixon to win the 1968 election. That should have been off the table. 68. It's the middle of a revolution. Well, it's the end of the revolution, but we didn't know that at the time. As far as anybody knew, we were still going. That revolution was transforming the United States at every level. The way we dressed, the types of drugs we took. It was transforming our relationship to sex, to music. Our culture was being changed. And in that moment, the majority of the population seemed to be on the left of the political spectrum, not on the right. So to have Nixon win was kind of a shock to everybody. But there was one more piece to the puzzle, to the Nixon puzzle, that was right before the election. President LBJ announced that progress had been made, and by right before the election, I mean end of October. It's like the date in my mind is October 30th. Don't quote me on that. Check it out. But right around there, right around Halloween, the president announces real progress has been made in Switzerland. Switzerland was four-party talks. The United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong were hashing out a peace deal. And when he announced real progress was being made, he meant there was a treaty about to be signed. There was still a little bit of work left to do, but it meant the Vietnam War was ending. It was over. And when that announcement was made, Hubert Humphrey's polling numbers, Nixon's polling numbers fell apart because a lot of the reason why people were going to vote for Nixon was promising to end the war if he was elected. Humphrey had been originally promising he would fight until we won. He changed his position and said, no, I'm ready to end the war. The problem was not enough Americans believed him to be fully on board. So by LBJ announcing the war was about to end, all of a sudden everybody who was on the single issue of the war, but ideologically were more in line with Humphrey, were willing to run over now and vote for him. Especially since he was the vice president for the president about to end the war. So the possibility of peace changed the election. Just a couple of days before the election, President Thieu of South Vietnam announced he was withdrawing from the peace talks. We started the lecture. We played a little snippet of LBJ talking to the Senate Minority Leader in the United States Congress. He's a Republican. That recorded telephone conversation, LBJ says he's a traitor. He's committed an act of treason. And what he means by Richard Milhouse Nixon had gone to the South Vietnamese. He had gone to President Thieu, and he said, if you back out of the peace talks, I will give you everything you want. Because Nixon knew if the peace talks went away, he could win the election. Nixon conspired with a foreign power to throw the election for the presidency, and he got that support from a foreign power. They threw the election. They almost missed 0.7%. That was the margin of victory, but it was enough in part because George Cornwallis had peeled off just enough Democrats in just enough states that it took away those electoral college votes. Isn't that cool? That the president cheated? It said paranoid freakout event because it's not a true secret. LBJ knows. The Republican Party knows. The Democratic Party knows. LBJ threatened to expose him to the public, but never does it. He walks away. But it means that every day Nixon's in office, there's the possibility that the public is going to find out that he threw the election, that he cheated in this really ugly way. It is an act of treason when you conspire with a foreign power to throw an election, right? Our elections are supposed to be sacred because we have to have faith in the outcome. And if you're cheating, we can't have faith in the outcome. And if you're working with foreign powers, you're compromising the United States with foreign powers, which is why LBJ uses the word treason. And it's one of the reasons why Nixon begins recording everything and becomes this really crazy paranoid guy, because he's worried all of this is going to implode on him. And then the irony is he cheats again in 1972, but that time he gets busted. The 72 thing was minor. It wasn't an act of treason. I don't even know if it qualifies as a misdemeanor. He spied on the Democratic Party headquarters. Big deal, who cares? Like in the grand scheme of things, compared to the millions he killed to win an election. At that point in 1968, probably about 1 million Vietnamese were dead, and we had probably lost about 20,000 U.S. military personnel. Over the course of the next 7 years, because the Vietnam War ends in 75 when South Vietnam falls, we officially withdraw in 73. But over the course of the next 7 years, another 2 million Vietnamese died. And another somewhere around 28,000, 30,000 American military personnel died. In other words, to win an election, Nixon literally killed millions of people by postponing the peace deal. Nixon brings us to the brink of World War III a couple of times, too. So I'm going to talk about one of those instances, just because it's a really amazing case study, and oh my God. And part of that case study also is really kind of cool because it telegraphs what our future is going to look like. And I'll show you what I mean. In 1970, the dictator of Pakistan, Yahya Khan, announces he's going to have free and fair elections, and he's going to hand over rule to the civilian government. The elections were scheduled for December. The assumption in Pakistan was that the desired party, which was led by Bhutto, was going to win. Now, we have to back up for a second. So for those of you who are on the fence about whether or not England is evil, let me explain how evil England is. When England made the deal with India to allow India to leave the British Empire, the English said, we're going to let you leave, but we have to chop you up into pieces. We're not going to let you leave intact. We're going to cripple you and then let you leave. India decided that it was worth it. And so what happened was England created Pakistan. Pakistan was carved out of India so that there could be a Muslim India and then a Hindu India. The irony is there are more Muslim Indians than so this didn't actually do that. It made it so that there was a small Muslim India and then a large India that was majority Hindu, but with a huge Muslim population. The reason the English did this is they just didn't want India coming out intact, divide and conquer. The irony is India is named after the Indus River. The Indus River is 100% in Pakistan. So India came out missing the thing it's named after. That's the level of sadistic cruelty the British inflicted on India. There's more. The British made it so that Pakistan was two separate pieces on either side of India. So there's a West Pakistan and an East Pakistan. And then they divided communities within India. So for example, Bengal was cut in half and one half of Bengal, West Bengal, ended up in India, and then East Bengal ended up East Pakistan. So it's not just that they're also cutting parts of India up. So they're dividing and conquering within. Like, this is the level of sadistic evil that they're pulling off. So by the time we get to the 1970 election, the December 7, 1970 election, there is a really strange and awkward relationship between West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Had a population of about 56 million people. East Pakistan had a population of 65 million people. In other words, East Pakistan was bigger in population by almost 20%. It's a significant population difference. West Pakistan is much richer. East Pakistan is very poor. The capital was in West Pakistan. The military was headquartered in West Pakistan. And the way West Pakistan treated East Pakistan was the same way Britain treated India. It was like it was a colony. It wasn't that these were two equal parts. This was one part was in charge, the other part was subservient. When Yahya Khan announced he was going to hold the election, the assumption was that Bangladesh, Pakistan, that the population there would be split just enough that the West Pakistani political party would win the election. That there wasn't going to be any type of unified voting going on in East Pakistan. And all the data showed that was the case. So the West Pakistani political and military leaders thought it was safe to hold the election. And then nature happened. On November 13, 1970, 3 weeks before the election, a little bit more than 3 weeks, a cyclone forms in the Indian Ocean and comes flying up the Bay of Bengal and smacks head-on into East Pakistan. So, for those of you who don't know, a cyclone is a hurricane, is a exact thing. It's just geography. Hurricanes take place in the Eastern Pacific and in the Atlantic. Typhoons take place in the Western Pacific, and cyclones are in the Indian Ocean. Why? I don't know. Just drives me nuts. So who came up with this and why? Stop. Let's just pick one of the three terms and go with it. Anyway, the cyclone is called Bola. B-H-O-L-A. It doesn't just hit. I don't want you thinking like a hurricane that's hit the United States. You don't need to have that image. I need you to think of hell on earth in the form of a storm. This storm is so catastrophic, it washes 250,000, 250,000 East Pakistanis into the Bay of Bengal and drowns them. And it's not done. Dysentery, cholera, just starvation, infrastructure loss, the fact that there is no medical facilities. So if you get injured and you get an infection, it could be deadly. So this is so catastrophic. Another 250,000 people die in the immediate aftermath of this cyclone. 500,000 people died because of a storm. It's the most deadly hurricane ever recorded, but it will be beaten in the future because the force of these types of storms that we are creating on Earth now because of global are so much worse. In other words, it's a snapshot into what our future is going to look like. But think about it from a political science standpoint. Storms suck, especially when they kill 500,000 people. But they're fascinating as hell when they change the way an election rolls out. All of a sudden, East Pakistan is unified politically. Now, it didn't help any that yet the dictator of Pakistan then declares, when the storm is done, 500,000 problems solved. Right? Because 500,000 East Pakistani voters have died, he doesn't have to worry about them anymore. East Pakistanis go to the polls, and out of the 162 seats, general seats, Pakistani party wins 160. They only missed 2. And there were 7 women's seats. They win all 7 women's seats. They blow out the delegation from East Pakistan, and that gives them the majority of delegates because East Pakistan is the majority of the population. So it doesn't even matter how good the other parties did in West Pakistan. Then the party that they were hoping would win, PPP, ends up walking away with 80 delegates, like 80-something delegates. The East Pakistanis had a... All of a sudden, the colony is in charge. All of a sudden, the downtrodden have won the election, and they're in charge, and they're supposed to take the government in the next few weeks. And Yahya Khan goes, that'll never, ever happen. And instead of handing over the government, he dissolves the government. Instead of letting the East Pakistani government come to West Pakistan and take over, like you would do in a democracy, he dissolves the election, he dissolves the government. And then he decides to do a war of genocide against his own people. The war of genocide will last almost 12 months. We don't know how many people are killed, but we have estimates. The estimates run somewhere between 300,000 to 3 million. If you split the difference and go with 1.5 million, that means 2 million people die in a 12-month period because 500,000 died from the hurricane that we call a cyclone, some unknown reason. As the war is going, the war against the people of East Pakistan, it becomes the East Pakistani population goes, all right, we're done. We're not going to keep taking this genocide. And they begin fighting back, but they begin fighting back with the intention of breaking away and becoming independent. It becomes clear that this is going to be a long, prolonged war. And so India decides it needs to get involved. But India has a problem. We dispute with the People's Republic of China. And the People's Republic of China has a positive relationship with Pakistan. In 1962, China attacked India and carved a little piece off in the very far north. They claimed that they were reuniting a piece of broken away Tibet with Tibet, which is ironic because, right, the Chinese are genociding the Tibetans. So it's like layers of, wow, I guess you wanted the whole genocidal country put together. That's neat, right? But, okay. Pakistan's part, Pakistan just gave it to China. They're like, it's yours, keep it. There's literally like 5 people in a yak living there. We're not going to fight you for it. You want it, it's yours. So, India is worried that if it jumps in the war on Bangladesh's side, China will use that as an excuse to pursue its other border dispute, which is further to the east in India. It's a northern part of Assam. China believes it should be able to cut that piece off. So, in 1971, something really politically on an international scale traumatic happens. And that thing is basically the end of the non-alignment pact. So during the Cold War, Egypt, India, and Yugoslavia, so Tito of Yugoslavia, Nehru of India, and Nasser of Egypt, they got together and they created the non-alignment pact. Their goal was not to participate in the Cold War. A whole separate third alliance that rejected the U.S. and U.S. imperialism and the Soviet Union. And there were more members in the non-alignment pact than in NATO and Warsaw Pact combined. The non-alignment pact took off and became a force that the Soviet Union and the United States had to deal with. They had plowed their own pathway. So a huge chunk of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War, the non-alignment pact. One of the keys they realized was they had to take out Nasser of Egypt. That's another story for another lecture. Spoiler alert, they succeed. We take out Nasser of Egypt. But there's still India, and there's still Yugoslavia. India takes itself out. In August of 1971, India signs an alliance with the Soviet Union, ending its membership in the non-alignment pact by default, right? Because the whole idea of ally with either the Soviet Union or the United States. The reason they do this is that way they can jump into the civil war that Pakistan is having on behalf of the Bangladeshis and not have to worry about the People's Republic of China attacking, because if they do, the Soviet Union will attack China. So, India finally decides to jump into the war. It's late 1971. When they do, we decide. Here's why. Henry Kissinger, our Secretary of State, believes the following. If there's chaos in the world, that chaos keeps other countries on their toes, that creates security for the United States. Our goal is to foment chaos, misery, war, civil war, everywhere, so that we can create such a political nightmare for the rest of the planet, we can freely operate. Our corporations can freely plunder third world countries, our military can go wherever it needs to extract resources, and there's nothing that the rest of the world can do because they're in such chaos. That's Henry Kissinger's philosophy. He is a chaos threat. And this is an opportunity to do this, he thinks. And so the United States goes into the war on Pakistan's side. Avoid the genocide. That's our goal. We have an aircraft carrier battle group in the Indian Ocean, and we start sending it north with the intention of getting it within striking range so that it can start attacking sites in East Pakistan to help the West Pakistani military keep control. In effect, we'll be entering the war against India and Bangladesh on Pakistan's side, which is interesting because potentially they into the war on our side, right? And this is getting complicated. The Soviet Union had a submarine battle group in the northern Bay of Bengal. The Soviet Union goes, no, you don't get into this war. This war is a war of independence for Bangladesh. You have no right to get involved. We're like, who are you to tell us what to do? We're the most powerful nation on earth. You can't stop us. We have a submarine battle group in the Bay of Bengal. And I don't know where they drew the line, but they drew a line across the map. And they said, if that aircraft carrier crosses that line, we're going to launch all our submarines against it, and we're going to sink it. We said, if you do that, it's World War III. And the Soviets went, are you really willing to trigger World War III so that you can have Pakistan conduct genocide in East Pakistan? Like, is that really what you want to do here? And apparently the answer was yes. Nixon kept the aircraft carrier battle group heading north. Yet Khan is starting to really wonder about the wisdom of all of this. He's thinking, do we really want to trigger World War III over this? Maybe this isn't worth it. In the process, he's also wondering, like, what does it look like on the other side? He decides, as the aircraft carrier battle group is heading north, as he's debating surrender, he's starting to think, maybe we should just surrender. He decides, just a couple of days before the war ends, to round up about 100 Bangladeshi members of the intelligentsia, university professors, engineers, MDs, and he mass executes them in the middle of the square. And then 2 days later, he surrenders. Hour before the U.S. aircraft carrier battle group crossed the Soviet Union's line. We were 1 hour away from World War III in 1971. And it was a genocidal maniac who walked us away. Right. It is the largest mass surrender of an army since World War II. When that Pakistani unit that's stuck in Bangladesh surrenders, there's this giant that has to be transported back to Pakistan. This is Nixon. He's doing other things. For example, in 1973, we overthrow, on September 11, 1973, we overthrow the democratic government of Salvador Allende. Chile was one of the world's best democracies. Had 80 different political newspapers, daily political newspapers. Chileans were so involved in politics, they could maintain 80 different newspapers in one city. It's unimaginable. We can't even maintain one. They're all our newspapers. I'm barely making it. And it's because Chileans consumed politics. They lived politics. They were involved. They had a vibrant, extraordinary democracy. 80% participation. Now, we had a glorious election when we got to 67% this last time. It was the highest we had achieved in 120 years. We normally, in the last few decades, run 50%. Here's this country with 80%. So what did we do? We overthrew the government. We took off with force the government. We even told a lie about how Salvador Allende ended. We said he committed suicide, and now we know he was executed. We stuck Chile with Pinochet. Pinochet is one of the most brutal Nazi, genocidal maniac rulers ever. I'm saying Nazi not to be inflammatory. He really far to the right, and he made it clear. He switched Chile's uniforms to look like Nazi uniforms so that he would show and exemplify who he really was. He killed so many Chileans. He committed genocide against his own population. He crippled Chile. He wrecked its political life. That is. In the midst of all of this, there's another way to look at Nixon, which is through the lens of his personality. Interestingly enough, I think a great way to look at Nixon is through the lens of NASA and space exploration. When Nixon got into office, shortly after he got into office, 5 months after he got into office, Nixon had nothing to do with that. That was Kennedy and Johnson. Nixon just happens to be there to reap the reward, right? He's only been president for 5 months. He hasn't had a chance to affect anything. Is it 5 months, 4 months? No, yeah, it was 5 months. We set foot on the moon. He doesn't think this is useful. He doesn't think this is important. What he thinks is, if I can cut the NASA budget, I can cut taxes for the rich, my friends, the people who put me into power. So he's looking for ways to roll back the NASA budget. NASA comes to him because people are starting to get bored. Only Americans could get bored with moon landings. How do you get bored with moon landings? Part of the problem was NASA. NASA was presenting the moon landings. They wanted to make it look routine because they were worried that in the event there was a disaster, we would freak out. So what they wanted to do was they overcompensated. They tried to make it look a little bit boring so that people were overly emotional about the events. And they did too good of a job. And they somehow made moon landings boring, which I don't understand, right? Here you put 3 men on the top of a giant Roman candle, and you hurtle them into space at 26,000 miles per hour, and there's a high probability they're just going to die. How is that not exciting? And people are watching golf on TV? What the hell? Putting a person on a rocket and sending them into space would be like golf in a minefield. Now that'd be interesting. He's about to putt. Oh no! He blew up. He stepped on a mine and died. Okay. NASA is worried about what's going to happen next because NASA's goal was never to end at the moon. After World War II, we grabbed a Nazi. His name was Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun, of course, is famous for the V1 and V2 rockets, right? That guy. He's the greatest rocket engineer in our entire planet's history. Of course, since we've only been doing rocket engineering for just over 100 years, it sounds ridiculous to say our entire planet's history. Well, technically, Heron at Alexandria did make a rocket about 2,000 years ago. It was a steam-powered static rocket that exploded the surface. So I guess Werner von Braun is the greatest rocket scientist in 2,000 years. So there. It's not really 120. Werner von Braun in the, I think it was 1920s, it might have been the 1930s. And the book was, how do we get to Mars? And the questions he asked were the problems that we still have today. In other words, he knew what we were up against, and he understood accurately what we needed to solve. And he actually solved some of those problems in the book, which shows you just how advanced he was, how far down he was. So we for our rocket program. And so we nabbed him and his assistant, even though they used slave labor to build the rockets that they then bombed England with. So they are at least criminals against humanity, but probably also war criminals too. We were really keen to overlook this. Werner von Braun said, when I look at the Soviet Union and I look at the United States, I find that the United States is closer to me politically. I mentioned he was a Nazi, right? And so he said, I choose the United States. He creates the Saturn V rocket. It is the best rocket ever. It sucks that he's a war criminal because you just want to celebrate the extra baggage. But unfortunately, he's a human being. Human beings are deeply flawed. And so we just have to accept this. What happens is he's asked to design a rocket to get us to the moon in 1962. By 64, we're producing the Saturn V rocket. It took 2 years to go from idea to production. We will never achieve that again. How long did it take for us to produce masks when COVID broke out? Imagine if we had to do something real, like a rocket, a piece of technology. The Saturn V is still the most advanced rocket ever built. It's still the largest rocket ever built. We are right now building the SLS to basically replace it. The SLS, we have never actually completed one. We're 12 years into by 10 years into constructing from the start of planning, so from 62 to 72, so the entire, including 2 years of planning, building the Saturn V. We built 15. We have yet to build one SLS, and it's 12 years, not 10. And in today's dollars, the 15 cost us $10 billion. I think is now at 12 billion for one rocket, not 15. And I made it today dollars for everything, so that we can compare. So when I say, imagine if we had to do something today, I mean we'll die. Like, that's not a thing. Like, if a meteor is coming to Earth and we need to nudge it out of the way, it's going to be like that movie. Well, I don't remember. It was Leonardo DiCaprio, and it was a blur. Don't look up. There's that movie. What we're going to do. If this happened in 1962, we'd have nudged the thing out of the way and we'd be fine. Thank God for the Chinese. They'll probably say this. What I'm hoping is that the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Japanese, and the Koreans get together, because If it's left to us, we're finished. Our species goes extinct. You know it's true. It's just, how do we get to the International Space Station right now? How does the United States get there? Russia. On, and the Russians take it. I don't know how we got here, but that's where we are. When Werner von Braun made Saturn V rocket, he didn't make a moon rocket. It is crazy overkill. That rocket doesn't go to the moon. That rocket goes to Mars. He built a machine because his eye was always on Mars. The moon was just an attempt to get to another place to show you could do it. It was a stepping stone. That was never meant to be the end for NASA. But NASA knows just enough about Nixon that they walk into a meeting with Nixon nervous. They're nervous as hell because they know there's the possibility that when they say Mars, he'll say no. And the tragedy is they already have the rocket. It's not like they have to reinvent the wheel to get to Mars. We're already well on the way. We just have this list of things that Werner von Braun has already identified. He's still alive, too, for the matter. And he's go to Mars. Please go to Mars mantra that NASA had. So they walk into the meeting with Nixon with a backup plan. And they try to talk Nixon into supporting the next step, which is to go to Mars. And Nixon goes, no, I'll never do that. And they go, why? And he goes, what's the point? Why are we going to Mars? They go, science, space exploration. We bring back all this technology. We make the world a better place. We discover our origins. If we don't get off this planet, and also, if anything happens to this planet, our species goes extinct. Our survival requires that we be on a minimum of 2 objects in the universe. There's a bunch of reasons to go into space. Velcro. Right? NASA invented Velcro because they needed to figure out a way to put things together easily in space when you're in a spacesuit and you're walking like this and you're trying to move things around. By the way, have you ever noticed how lean the Russians are? I mean, they're totally agile. Like, they could do acrobatics. Our spacesuits, we walk around like this. I have 2 hypotheses. One, we've over-engineered our spacesuits, and the Russians have they did what was necessary, or the Russian cosmonauts are dying slowly, and we're actually taking care of our astronauts. So, when Nixon says no, the NASA guys are heartbroken. They're basically weeping at this point. But the backup plan had a hook in it. The backup plan was, okay, how about a space shuttle? And Nixon goes, what is that? And they go, it's a pickup truck. It's a reusable space pickup truck. And he goes, so it's not a one-shot thing. No, we're going to land the thing and we can reuse it. And Nixon goes, I get that. That makes sense to me. Okay, let's do it. What NASA was thinking, we can't get Mars, let's get an instrument for building a spaceship in outer space. We'll develop that technology with the intention of still going to Mars at some point. This is just a step so that we can build a big spaceship in outer space. Because if you build a big spaceship on Earth, you can't launch it into outer space. You need to build it in outer space and then launch it from Earth that way. So Nixon okays it, and that's why we ended up with a space shuttle program instead of a Mars program. But there's one more NASA story that's also worth telling. So in the 1970s, the planets were going to line up in a way that it would allow you, the big planets, the 4 big gas giant planets, they were going to line up in a way that you could launch one spacecraft. And that one spacecraft was going to, using the gravity of each planet, to accelerate. They would spin off towards the next planet. It was perfect. It was like a 1 in 120-year window to do this. For the price of one spacecraft, you could visit 4 planets simultaneously. So they go to Nixon. They're scared out of their minds how this meeting's going to go. And they go to him and they say, we can visit 4 planets with 1 spaceship. It's a 4-for-1 deal. He goes, no. They're like, please, Mr. President, don't know anything about these planets. We need to know what they're like to understand our solar system, to understand space. This is important science we're doing. And he goes, look through a telescope. You go, are you kidding? By the time the light travels from that planet to here, it's just a little fuzzy ball. And then it has to get through our atmosphere. We don't really have any clue. We know Saturn has rings, has a big dark spot on it. We think there's at least 4 moons, 4 around Jupiter and at least 1 moon around Saturn. We don't really know anything else. You gotta let us do this. They negotiate back and forth. Nixon the whole time is thinking tax cuts for the rich and get rid of your stupid NASA program. Who needs science? What has science ever gotten us? We know everything we need. Finally, after haggling, negotiating, begging, Nixon goes, okay, fine, but just 2 planets. So they go, yes, sir, Mr. President. Right? Because if they make a program that goes to 2 planets, they will still automatically go to the other 2. They're lined up, so it will still go there. But they can make the program for 2 to appease the moron president who's short-sighted and can't understand that they'll still get the other 2. So they're like, oh, thank you, Mr. President. We so appreciate this. 2 planets. 2 planets. We'll just do Jupiter and Saturn. 2 planets. And then they go and they make Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, and they launch them, and they're the most successful space exploration missions ever, right? The science that comes, the images that come back. Like when they're passing Jupiter, they notice some bizarre shape on the side of Io. Like, what the hell is this on Io? And they realize it's a volcanic plume. There are active volcanoes on Io. Like, just the stuff that's coming back is mind-boggling. Turns out Jupiter has a really thin ring. It turns out there's these details that we would have never known that are just absolutely insane. Yeah, we actually did. We got all 4 planets twice because Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 went zipping past both. Because you have to always do 2 before it blows up, right? See, there's a backup. Neither one blew up. Now, that's great because NASA loses about 50% of its missions. So, but think about what they're doing. It's high-end, crazy stuff. It's why NASA tries to only ever do relatively cheap missions. That way, when they lose a mission, they didn't lose a bunch of money. They're just like, oh, okay, fine. We'll try again. Because they used to do expensive missions and then keep losing them. They lost a $1 billion mission about 30 years ago because somebody had screwed up and they in miles and they needed to switch to metric and they didn't do the switch. And so the spacecraft went too close to Mars' atmosphere and burnt out. That's an argument for getting rid of miles. I know, I get it. 5,280 is such a magical number. It's so easy to do the math in your head. I understand the attachment. 0, 10, 10 sucks. Who likes a number? It's too complicated. So, this is Nixon's mentality. He's paranoid, he's short-sighted, he doesn't understand big concepts. His goal is to just operate within a box he understands. He goes down a ball plane and he gets replaced by. His goal is just to sort of somehow restore some measure of confidence in the federal government. There are 3 assassination attempts on him because he pardons Nixon, and then we get Carter. Carter, of course, is a train wreck. Carter comes into power because we had turned into a democracy. 1976 is the first time that both parties democratically elected through the primary to become president. And Carter won the Democratic primary. He was very much an outsider, and he doesn't get things done. It's a terrible 4 years, and it ends in shame with the Iran hostage crisis. and the 1979 oil shortage. We've actually already talked about a bunch of this, but I just want to make sure we're still on the same page. Reagan comes in. Reagan is like excited. He doesn't understand science. These are things that go over his head. And his goal is just to operate within a simplistic box. So the space shuttle finally reaches the ability to be useful. But of course, Reagan is never going to commission a Mars expedition. What he wants to do is use the space shuttle for military purposes. He wants to use the space shuttle for capitalist purposes. And so the space shuttle gets used as a very transportation device. It would have been a lot cheaper to just stick it on a rocket and put the satellite in orbit. That's what we did. To finish up the NASA story, because I think since I started this thing, I should do something with it. The Clinton administration still doesn't have Mars on their mind. Short term, long term maybe, but they decided to go after the International Space Station, and so we actually International Space Station. It's in orbit right now. It was very successful in the sense that we got it up there. We've added pieces to it. The problem is what purpose does it serve? Now, it's a fantastic place to conduct science experiments, but its long-term goal has always been Mars. Bush Jr. decommissioned the space shuttle because he thought it was too expensive. And the Republicans had, by the time he did this, for 25 years, been cutting NASA's budget. And it was at the point where NASA was going to have to start making choices. They had to either keep the space shuttle and then stop sending probes to other planets, or they could keep the probes to other planets and they could do things like space telescopes. And NASA decided they didn't want the space shuttle anymore, so we decommissioned the space shuttle. That's why we can't get to the International Space Station. The space shuttle, of course, was finally decommissioned, but it was the Bush administration that triggered this, and then the Obama administration began the process of creating the SLS to replace the space shuttle and the Saturn V rocket. In any case, the Reagan administration, as I said last time, their goal was to get us back in the idea that war was okay. And as I said last time, they successfully got us into war in the Bush administration. Right? Bush attacks Panama in '89, they attacks Iraq in '91. We win both wars. And we're feeling good about ourselves because of the first wars that we win after World War II. And then something goes sideways. Somehow, Bush Sr. doesn't win a second term. He wins a war in Panama. The Berlin Wall comes down. The Eastern Bloc, Soviet sphere of influence. He wins a war in Iraq, and then the Soviet Union collapses. He wins the Cold War. Bush Sr. is the most successful president in terms of warfare and foreign policy since World War II. He has pulled off a miracle. Votes for Bill Clinton and replace him, and he becomes a one-term president. It's a train wreck in the minds of Republicans because they can't believe it. They can't believe this has happened. Bill Clinton has an interesting situation because he has an incompleted war. We destroyed Iraq. We wrecked Iraq. We made Saddam Hussein. We won. No two ways about it. But George Bush Sr. left a little piece incomplete. He said, all you have to do to be reintegrated back into the international scene is get rid of your weapons of mass destruction. Now, officially and technically, chemical weapons are not weapons of mass destruction. They are terror weapons. They are not weapons of mass destruction. Nukes and biological weapons are weapons of mass destruction. Historically speaking, chemical weapons have never been successful at doing mass destruction. So if you look at what chemical weapons did in World War I, or in the Iran-Iraq War, yeah, you killed a few thousand people here or there, and it was a really scary, horrific death, but it wasn't a battlefield changer. If you release anthrax in the battlefield, you will change the shape of the battlefield. Right? If you nuke a city, then you will change the nature of that war. That's what a weapon of mass destruction is. Conventional weapons can be used as a weapon of mass destruction if they're for example, the firebombing of Dresden, where we killed about 20,000 people by burning to death. Right, so that's what's strange about this chemical weapon obsession that we have. In any case, the Iraqis took their chemical weapons out into multiple locations in the desert in 1992 in August and blew them all up. Because they interpreted George Bush Sr., if you get rid of your weapons, as a wink, wink, get rid of your weapons. The reason that way is we supplied them. And they thought if they turned over the weapons and it said made in USA on the side of the VX gas canister or the mustard gas canister or the nerve gas canister, that it would look bad for the United States. And so they thought they were integrating themselves in more by getting rid of the stuff before a UN team arrived. So when the UN inspection team arrives in 92, and they go, where are your weapons? Hand them over to us. The Iraqis go, we don't have any. And the UN inspection team goes, oh no, here are the receipts. The US handed us the receipts. We have the serial numbers for them. And the Iraqis are like, dude, we blew those up. We literally don't have any. So what ends up being the UN weapons inspection program that lasts until 98, that lasts like 5.5 years until the UN weapons inspection program. That weapons inspection program, their goal was to sift the sand in the desert until they found the serial numbers. That's what they were doing. And they found 98% of them. So it turns out the Iraqis were not lying. Think about it. You blow up a rocket, what are the odds that that little serial number tag is going to survive? Apparently 98%. But there's no way it's going to be 100%. So I think it's easy to assume the 2% was because the piece of metal burnt and melted and got flushed in the air. And you're never going to find it. Clinton knew the Iraqis weren't lying. But what Iraq provided Clinton with was a happy hunting ground. Anytime the American public needed distraction, he would stir a hornet's nest and make up some kind of crazy in Iraq distraction event. And so something would happen in the United States, he'd be like, oh my God, look at what's happening in Iraq right now. And the American public would be like, oh yeah. And then he could distract. And that's what he did. And he kept Iraq under a financial lock, a trade lock. They couldn't import food, they couldn't import medicine. He cut Iraq off from the rest of the world. He imposed the most brutal sanctions ever imposed in the history of sanctions. Over the course of his 8 years as president, he killed 800,000 Iraqis by starving them to death or depriving them of medicine. That's a UN stat. That is the official UN number. 500,000 of the 800,000 were aged 5 and under. We literally murdered 500,000 babies over the course of 8 years so that Clinton could cynically exercise from time to time. Finally, in 98, he actually bombs Iraq. And that's why he has the weapons inspection machine. The reason I'm spelling all this out is I want you to know how cynical this period becomes. It is a period of time where something like human rights just is not in the U.S. calculation. And it's a nasty that's being committed by both the Republican and the Democratic presidents, right? Bill Clinton was a Democrat. In the Clinton administration, of course, and it's an important thing, is we're finally starting to get real traction on global warming. It's becoming clear that global warming really is the direction we're heading. We anticipated this. there is a thing called the Byrd-Hagel resolution. It is one of the nastiest things in U.S. history. The Byrd-Hagel resolution, 1997. In the event we enter into a global warming treaty with the rest of the world, we cannot cut our own emissions if those emissions will hurt our economy unless the third world also does so. In other words, they locked us into a situation where if, say, the Kyoto protocols were passed, we would not be able to sign because the Kyoto protocol said, no, only the rich countries need to cut emissions right now. We'll make the third world cut emissions later after they've done a little bit more development. It's unfair that the first world had to do all this polluting to develop its industry and its economy to this point, and now we're going to impose some kind of mandate on the third world that will hamper that development. We need to let them develop. In other words, anticipated what we were going to do in the future. That is why the United States could not sign the Kyoto protocols. There was a resolution passed in '97 that prevented that from happening. They blocked it preemptively. The Clinton administration was also the administration that launches the second wave on the war on drugs. So now flashback to Reagan. Elected on, I'm going to end crime in America. I'm going to be tough on crime. We're going to change the nature of crime in America by making it hard for criminals to act, and then when they get caught, we're going to put them in prison for really long sentences. We're going to get rid of this human garbage. That's the rhetoric coming out of the administration. And he does the war on drugs. The war on drugs was a genocide that primarily aimed at black communities. That was primarily aimed at black communities. So, a way to think of this. When Reagan took office, 0.3% of the adult male population was in parole, probation, or in prison. 0.3. By the time Reagan is running for re-election, it's 3.0. He increased the incarcerated population by 1 order of magnitude. He made it literally 10 times higher. That is higher than any other society has ever achieved, except one. During the purges in the 30s, I think 36, 37, right? The purges were much longer than 2 years. But if I remember correctly, the high point of the purges was 1936, 1937. At that point, the Soviet Union briefly crossed the 3% mark. They got to like 3.1, 3.2%. The purges, of course, are when Stalin had a paranoid meltdown and began mass incarcerating the Soviet population. And it was one of those insane moments where, you're just walking down the street, the NKVD, they haul you off, they interrogate you, they torture you. And when you're under torture, you're going to give them information. The problem is, you're going to give them any information that you think they want. So they're like, we know you're working with a list of people. They don't know anything. They're torturing you because they're hoping that you are, and you'll give them names. But because you're under torture, you'll give them names. And so the next thing you know, you're like saying the name of your mom, the name of your sister, the name of your best friend, giving them names because you want the torture to stop. And now they're going to get arrested, they're going to be tortured, and you're going to get sent to a gulag, and they're going to get sent to a gulag, and it's this crazy feedback loop. In that chaos, they briefly got over the 3% mark. We have sustained 3% now for 40 years. What population intentionally eliminates 3% of its potential taxpayer population, 3% of its potential labor force, 3% of its potential consumers? That's a huge number, right? It's 2.5% of the adult white male population. It's 3.5% of the Latinx male population. 8% of the black population. Blacks don't do drugs at a higher rate than whites or Latinos. It's the same. In fact, when it comes to drug dealer rates, as a percentage of the population, drug dealers are more likely to be white than black. You would think if you're going to do a war on drugs, you would focus on drug dealers. In other words, statistically, what you should have is more white than black people. Not where it's more than 3 times as many black people as white people as a percentage of the population. The reason why this happens is because the Reagan administration is fulfilling the promise that's been made, the implicit promise that's been made, which is that he will defend white power, that he is the anti. He's not going to say it though. So Barry Goldwater said it in '64. George Cornwallis said it in '68. Nixon doesn't say it in '68, and Nixon gets elected. Reagan hears this loud and clear, and so he doesn't say it in 1980. But everybody knows that's exactly what he means. It's At the time that Reagan does the war on drugs, our crime rate was through the roof. The United States was in terrible trouble. It was so bad that by the end of the late 1980s, there were refereed journal articles talking about the end of the United States. That the United States was going to collapse under the weight of the crime wave. That the United States was going to go failed state, like think Somalia failed state. And so Reagan used that fuel to do the war on drugs. He would say, look at the crime rate. It's insane. We've got to do something. So that's the basis under which he justified it. The crime rate suddenly plunges in 1993. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, crime went away. Not completely, obviously, but the crime rate 93, 94, 95 was lovely. It was in, say, 88. By the time we get to 98, crime is still where it was in 94 and 95. There's no massive surge in crime. And then Clinton does the second wave of the war on drugs. Why? It's a cynical opportunity for him to create popularity amongst the conservative population that is seeking to have this kind of control. He knows it will be wildly popular, and it will help his chances of recapturing both houses of Congress. He doesn't recapture either house of Congress. Instead, he gets embroiled in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and the president is impeached for a blowjob, which is one of the most amazing things that has to ever happen in U.S. history. Right? The president ends up impeached because he got oral sex, consensual oral sex from a. Now, I'm against what he did, because just for the record, he was her superior, and so it is hypocrisy. He shouldn't have done it. But at the end of the day, it's not like he did something criminal with her. He did something unethical with her. And he gets impeached. He goes to the Senate, and of course, no Democrat votes to remove him from office. And so as a result, he survives the impeachment, and he isn't removed from office. But the American public was incensed. We couldn't that this happened. So even though Clinton doesn't recapture either house of Congress, the Republicans take a beating in both houses, and their majorities shrink in both houses because the American public punishes the Republicans for impeaching the president for oral sex. One of the results of this is that it builds upon the cynicism of 1973. When there are a series of events in U.S. history where we become really cynical. One of them is the assassination of JFK. It really hurt. So if you talk to boomers and you talk to them about JFK, they will get teary-eyed. This really affected that generation. They saw JFK as this young, hopeful, optimistic guy, but he's our second youngest ever president. He was the youngest person ever elected to be president, but our youngest president was Theodore, because his president died as he was VP. He was 42. JFK was 43. So that's just so we're clear, so that nobody freaks out in the commentary later. Just calm. Be calm. It's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. I don't know how, but we're going to get through this. Bobby Kennedy being assassinated and MLK being assassinated in 1968 creates an enormous amount of cynicism. In 1973, when Watergate happens, that creates even more cynicism. At that point, we're having layer and layer and layer of cynicism heaped on. When Clinton gets impeached, another layer gets heaped on, because there's this kind of weird sense of, what was that about? How does that happen? Where did that come from? And then came the 2000 election. The 2000 election was really strange, even before the presidential election. In the primaries, in the beginning, it really looked like John McCain was going to take the Republican primary. But with just the right amount of mudslinging in Florida in the 2000 primary, Florida went to George Bush Jr., and the next thing you know, George Bush Jr. had enough momentum to carry him the rest of the way, and he beats John McCain in the primaries. It was a shock. George Bush Jr. wasn't even supposed to run. Jeb Bush was talking about running, but then when George realized Jeb was going to run, he got jealous. He got jealous of his brother. And his brother, right, because George was older. So George was like, no, I get to go first. And Jeb's like, but you don't even have a 3-digit IQ, brother. You can't string together an intelligent sentence. How can you be president? And he's like, that's my turn. So they hold the election. The state that's going to decide the election is Florida. Now, that's terrible at every level, because, right, it's Florida. And you need to make this face when you say Florida. I'm moving to Florida. That's how that needs to turn out. Just Florida? But it's also bad because Jeb Bush, the governor of Florida, talk about conflict of interest. So we have this election. It's shockingly close. If I remember correctly, Al Gore wins by 500,000 votes. He wins the popular vote by 500,000 votes. It's tiny, tiny margin. They go through and they count Florida, with the exit polls in Florida, and they conclude Florida is going to go for Al Gore. So the news agencies all put Florida they put it in the Al Gore column. At that point, the cameras pan over to Jeb Bush. He's having dinner with his family at a restaurant. He's just eating, stuffing his face. The TV screen is right there in the background. Jeb Bush sees Florida go into the Al Gore column. He gets up from his meal. He has a look of shock on his face. He gets up from his meal and he goes out of the restaurant. Like he went to go fix something is what it looks like. And then, a couple of hours later, they move Florida out of the Gore column and they put it back into the we don't know column. And then, I don't remember exactly what time, but 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning, Florida gets put into the Bush column, which means Bush has won the election. Gore refuses to concede. Articles are getting produced in Great Britain, in the BBC, talking about irregularities in Florida. That's another election. But I just want you to know there's a bunch of irregularities. Like there's a list of probably things that go sideways in Florida. The Supreme Court, the Florida Supreme Court rules 5-2 that Gore has the right for a recount. Gore does something dumb. He doesn't ask for the whole state to be recounted. I don't know what he was thinking. He only asked for 3 counties to get recounted. The 3 counties he thought had the most irregularities. The Bush, states' rights, Republicans, decide to the Florida Supreme Court to the federal Supreme Court in an act of hypocrisy. If you believe in states' rights, you should have left that alone, but they don't. The Republican-appointed judges, I shouldn't say Republicans, one of the judges was a Republican who votes the other way. The conservative judges vote in Gore v. Bush 2000 that Gore doesn't have the right to recount the state. The justification is the following. Why are you doing 3 counties? You should either do the whole state or none of the state. It's not fair to the other counties. Which, by the way, I agree. I think that's right. But the Supreme Court has the power to then say, okay, yes, we will approve this. Now you have to do the whole state. The next part of the argument is, who's going to pay for this recount? I have lots of suggestions. Maybe Bush and Gore can use their campaign coffers to pay for it. Or Florida taxpayers could pay for it. I mean, after all, if Florida botched the election, isn't it Florida's responsibility to make sure they got it right in the entire country? And when you have an election where one candidate wins the state by just a couple of hundred votes, don't you think you ought to automatically recount it just to make sure that that was the right result? Don't you want to be sure? And then, as if this isn't enough, the Supreme Court also rulings in the history of the Supreme Court, and if you've taken my U.S. government class, you know that the Supreme Court is not known for smart rulings. They say, it's going to take too long. What are we talking about, 10 days? You don't want to spend 10 days to make sure you got the election correct? It is U.S. law that both candidates have to have the framework of the government in place by election day. So both candidates can continue to set up so that by the time the inauguration day goes, they hit the ground running. And you're like, well, it'll cost them money. Yeah, but who cares? It's their campaign coffer money. Like, I don't have any sympathy for spending that money. That make them spend that money. And let's do this election correct. But anyway, Gore v. Bush, 5-4, the Supreme Court shoots down Gore's recount. In December, Gore surrenders. And that George Bush Jr. is the president of the United States. And he tells the country, please don't protest. We don't need that. We need to back a president. He's the president. The Supreme Court has made its decision. By me not getting the recount, there's no path forward. Protesting is just going to cause us to split and become more divided, because we were already really divided by that point. I mean, the president got impeached for oral sex. That's insane. What is the point of that? I didn't know. Certainly not an impeachable offense. It's bizarro land. So, Bush is the president. The first thing I did was I turned to my wife and said, Bush is going to attack Iraq. She goes, why would you do that? What are you saying? You're just making stuff up. I go, no. She goes, why? He's illegitimate. The whole country knows he lost the popular vote, and the whole country suspects there were irregularities in Florida. That his brother, or maybe not his brother, but people working for his brother, intentionally altered the results of the election. They either did it by putting things up front. One of the BBC articles about how the people who have felonies were purged from the voter rolls. And if I remember correctly, they identified 55,000 people who were unlawfully purged from the voter rolls. It turned out it was 90,000. But at that point, they had realized that I think it was 2,000 people were supposed to be purged from the voter rolls. That 55,000 people, the majority of them were going to be core voters. The way we know that is because they were the number of Black and number of Latinx voters who were in that population were really high. The number of white voters in that purged population was really low. It may have been 10,000 Gore votes that were purged incorrectly. Well, Bush only won by 200 votes. So just that one cheat event is enough to have thrown the Florida election. Katherine Harris was the second state from Florida who conducted the purge. So here's this illegitimate president who didn't win the popular vote. There's really clear signs of voting irregularities in Florida. How is he going to legitimize himself? He needs a war because the American public will back the president in a war. The first guy to try this was our fourth president, James Madison. He was a little nervous that he wasn't going to win the election in 1812. So in October, 1 month before the election, he went to declaration of war on Great Britain. Congress said, sure, we'll give you the declaration of war. We go to war with Great Britain. They beat the crap out of us, but Madison wins re-election. And that's the important thing. They burned Washington, D.C. They beat us so badly. Like they burned the Library of Congress because they burned the whole city. We had to paint the White House because it wasn't originally white, but now it's charred from the burn damage. So we needed to paint it to hide the black from the burn, and so we made it white. Like that's the extent to which we got our asses handed to us. It's a catastrophe. That's the one war we fought Canada and they beat us. So the next time you're hanging out with Canucks and they're like, oh, because I'm from the U.S. Just remember they beat us in the one war we fought. So it's humiliating. Don't do that. It makes us look silly. It just shows that we don't know anything. Really, you don't know the result? The British officially surrendered, but they surrendered on December 25th. Do you need any other explanation? Merry Christmas. Bush, in my mind, immediately needs to start a war. Here's what he does. He starts flying spy planes over Chinese airspace. I'm like, please do it. Not with China. You need to go to war with a country we can defeat militarily. You know, Iraq, Germany, Japan, one of those, Italy, something. It needs to be somebody who will surrender. They have a... So, not Vietnam, not Afghanistan, not China. We need to have a list that American politicians say when they walk into the White House, these are the countries you don't attack, ever. That doesn't turn out well for anybody who attacks them. Because clearly American politicians know nothing about history and don't know what that list is. In any case, picking on China, finally, the Chinese are sick of it. Multiple times they would send up these MiGs, and what they would do is they would do these flybys where they go really close to our spy planes. They're really dangerous stuff. The thing that ended these games was a MiG came up and clipped the tail of one of our spy planes. The MiG goes down, the pilot dies with it. The Chinese lose their pilot. Our plane is forced to do an emergency landing in China. Like, not good. Our plane lands in, and the Chinese are like, thank goodness we get to examine one of your spy planes before we hand it back over to you. Thanks for wrecking your plane here. This is going to be a lovely, lovely intel day for us. And so we're off to a really dumb start. It was unbelievable. And then he passes tax cuts for the rich, which is what Reagan did. That was the basis of Reaganomics. If you cut taxes for the rich, they'll go down. It'll come down to you. Because the rich will spend their money on what? What do rich people buy? When you're worth $200 billion, what is there possibly left for you to buy? Twitter. Right. How much of that Twitter money is going to trickle down to us? To understand, yeah, exactly zero. To understand the mentality here, there's a person I want to pull up. His name is Jack Welch. CEO of GE, General Electric, in 1981. He served as CEO for 20 years. Does that seem too long? Anyway, when he took over, GE was worth $14 billion. It was a lot of money. They're doing great. Sorry, their profit margin was $14 billion, which is a lot of them. Fantastic. A huge chunk of that, about 55%, went to the shareholders. Okay? So in other words, if you bought stock in GE, you were going to get just slightly more than half of the profits being produced, which is nice. 14 billion, you're getting seven point something. Nobody's going to complain about that if they've got stock in GE. Jack Welch goes, American corporate culture sucks. We need to change. Here's what he wants to change. In the United States, probably every corporation was extraordinarily inefficient. It had whole departments that weren't doing much. It had workers who had a lot of slack time in their day. What Jack Welch did was, he said, we're getting rid of all of that. GE is going to streamline, firing people. He began shutting down plants. He completely reworked GE's corporate culture. If you were a producer in the top 20%, he would give you raises, bonuses. If you weren't, you were on the chopping block to get fired. And part of this was the mantra of shareholders come first. When corporations, by the way, Thomas Jefferson freaked out. He went, I don't know, dude, I think this is a terrible mistake. Corporations were illegal. We need to legalize. People like Jefferson were saying, no, we shouldn't do this. The idea behind the corporation was you would get 1 year to operate. You could only operate within the state you were created. So there was, forget multinational corporations, there wasn't even multi-state corporations, right? So the idea was creating that corporation because it was the only way to create whatever thing you were trying to create. You needed a public entity that was large enough that it could bring together the resources necessary to create this end project. And then you could get renewed, but you'd have to go through a renewal process every year. So you had to prove that your existence was necessary for the economy of that state. And little by little, more and more powerful and richer, and they influenced more and more politicians until they loosened up the laws. And at some point, eventually, they allowed these corporations to start to operate in multiple states by allowing corporations to create themselves in multiple states. So, for example, the Standard Oil of Ohio, well, there was a Standard Oil of Indiana, and there was a Standard Oil of Pennsylvania, right? You just keep doing that. And eventually somebody went, what's the point? We all know it's a single entity. Let's let it merge. And that's eventually. And these corporations end up dominating our economy. They end up dominating the global economy. They take over the planet's economy. They went from being illegal to basically being the only players on the global stage. But even as late as 1980, even though they were all money grubbing, and they would do really nasty, awful things, but I don't want you walking away thinking that these were good guys. I'll give you an example. In 1950, Guatemala, they have democratic elections. By the way, terrible thing to do if the United States has economic interests in your country. We will overthrow your democracy. We don't want it. They had democratic elections, and they elected this guy named Arbenz. He was a socialist. The first thing he did was he forcibly purchased at fair market value the plantations, the banana plantations, that a corporation called operating in Guatemala. Once he did that, he then took the peasant population that was producing the bananas, right? And he handed the land over to them, ending their status as peasants and turning them into farmers. obviously a terrible, evil thing to do. Because now, if United Fruit wants Guatemalan bananas, they can't grow them using peasants. They have to from farms, which means they'll have to pay fair market price for those bananas, which means corporate profits aren't going to be great. And nobody likes that. Well, nobody who's a shareholder, nobody who's playing Wall Street, New York likes it. So United Fruit began running ads in the United States saying communists had taken over Guatemala. It's not true. Socialists had taken over Guatemala. And then they went to President Eisenhower and they said, can we get that government overthrown? Campaign of running ads and talking to the president, we sent in the Marine Corps, we shot the place up, and we overthrew the democratically elected governments of Guatemala. And this is just one of many examples of what we did in Central America, because we wanted cheap bananas. By the way, that company today is called Chiquita. So the next time you're eating a Chiquita banana, just remember how much blood went into fertilizing that banana. I think blood is rich in nitrogen. It is fantastic fertilizer. Just saying. You know what I mean? Like, if you're going to fertilize with humans, you will produce good bananas. It's very delicious, wonderful bananas. Amazing. But even with that, there was still a sense that corporations as public entities owed the community. That is to say, there was a sense that corporations were they were Texan corporations, they were high-end corporations. They belonged as a part of the community. They were there to drive the engine of the community economically, socially. They were the glue that pulled everything together. And that's where Jack Welch disagrees. He's like, no, corporations are there to make profits for the shareholders. He starts off a company that gave 55% of its profits to shareholders. By the time he's done, it's 88% of the profits go to the shareholders. He's transformed the corporate mentality. His $14 billion worth of profits a year, by the time he's done, is $400 billion of profit per year. That's $386 billion that could have been put back into the community by hiring people, by developing the community, that now is ending up in the hands of really super investors. In other words, we have a massive recalibration in the 1980s that we call Reaganomics, where we put the interests of the super rich above everybody else, including the community. And our corporations go through a process of becoming multinational corporations. Ford, at one point in the 90s, say, I'm probably messing this up. The way I remember it was the Crown Victoria. I don't even know if they make that thing anymore. It was like this big luxury Ford thing. It was like a land boat. It was too wide to fit in European cities. Like, you couldn't drive it in a European city. It would take up both lanes and it would scrape them on the wall. So huge. It was going to win Best Import. And Ford turned down the award because they didn't want the American public to realize that Ford was no longer in the United States. It was made in the Philippines, it was made in Vietnam, it was made in Mexico, it was made in Canada. It was made just about everywhere but the United States. And so we had transformed the way we did business, the way we thought the role of business was in the United States. So by the time we get to George Bush Jr., we're in this phase where everything is about profit and maximizing profits. We need to, the economy, as if the economy was a person that you need to worry about. There's this attitude that somehow the rich get richer. If we can cut taxes for the rich, somehow that'll make the economy stronger. The reality, of course, is the rich don't spend their money, in part because they can't. How do you spend $200 billion? Even purchasing Twitter, he's only spent a quarter. He still has $150-something billion left. How do you spend it? And of course, buying Twitter is really weird because he's just going to lose money. He's not going to make money. This is a terrible business decision. This is just an ego event, right? This is just a narcissist freaking out, talking about free speech. Every time he says free speech, I hear, I'm going to bring Trump back onto Twitter. Well, I'm assuming that's what he means. I don't understand what the motivation could possibly be. Anyway, so Junior cut taxes. Reagan cut taxes for the rich. He cut taxes for the rich twice, right? 1981 and 1987. He raised taxes 5 times. Something everybody forgets about Reagan. When he was raising the taxes, he put the burden of the tax hike on the middle class. And so what ends up happening is we end up in a situation where we cut taxes for the super rich, but we've transferred the tax burden out to the middle class. And then, of course, we get Obama. Obama actually spent a significant chunk of his presidency undoing some of the things that had been done before him. By the way, just for the record, so did George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. disagreed with a bunch of what Reagan had done. Tax cuts. George Bush Sr. raised taxes. He ran in 1988 saying no new taxes. And then he actually raised taxes. It was one of the reasons why people voted against him in 92. They were so mad. They felt betrayed. What they don't remember is when he said no new, he said, read my lips, no new taxes. Well, the K and the W are silent in the word no. He meant you will know new taxes because I'm going to give them to you and then you'll know them. That's obviously not what he meant, but it's fun to pretend because that's what we mostly do, right? Our reality is mostly a construct that we put together. Like, I want this to be true. It's clearly not, but if I believe it hard enough, make it true. At least for me. Like the earth is flat. And Democrats are lizard aliens that eat children's faces. Why somebody wants that? No? I would think that would be like a truth you wouldn't want to make up. You would be like, no, I'm going to pretend Democrats are actually people even though I know they're lizard aliens in children's faces. So one of the things Obama tried to do was bring back a liberal era type program. That liberal era type program was the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And he succeeds, he pulls it off. It's actually a fun story, but we don't have time. But his election triggers a mass insanity event. That mass insanity event leads to the creation of 2 movements, the Tea Party movement and the birther movement. And the person at the forefront of the birther movement, none other than Donald Trump. Here's the argument. Obama can't be president because he's not a citizen. So Obama was born in Hawaii. U.S. law is very clear about this. If you're born in the United States, Hawaii is part of the United States. We annexed it in 18. We made it a state in, was it 59? I think it was 59. Maybe it was 58. I don't remember now. The same time we brought in Alaska. By the way, you know how we used to do slave-free? When we did Alaska and Hawaii, obviously that wasn't a thing anymore. We did Republican Democrat, and Alaska was letting as a Republican state, and Hawaii was letting as a Democratic state. And what is that? Well, what if they change in an election? Anyway. So Hawaii is a state. Being born in Hawaii automatically makes you a citizen. That's just how it works. So the idea that somehow Obama wasn't a citizen required you to believe he somehow wasn't born in Hawaii. He ended up releasing his birth certificate. It's really embarrassing. He's the first president to ever have to release his birth certificate to prove he was actually a U.S. birth. And the only reason we did that was because he was black. Because that's the only reason to have the birther movement to begin with. Because think about it. John McCain wasn't born in the United States. The guy he beat in the 2008 election was born in Panama. So here we have a black man who was born in the United States and therefore is eligible to run for president, And he beats a white guy who wasn't, but was still eligible to be president. Because the Constitution doesn't say you have to be born in the United States. The Constitution says you have to be born a natural-born citizen. Well, if you're born overseas to a U.S. citizen and your birth is reported to a consulate within a time frame, I don't remember what the time frame is, you are a natural-born U.S. citizen. You are eligible, therefore, to be president. There was nothing wrong with McCain or Canada-born Ted Cruz from running for president, because Ted Cruz was born to U.S. citizens. In other words, the whole birther movement, since Obama was born to a U.S. citizen, it wouldn't have mattered where he was born. He could have been born in Indonesia. He could have been born in Mars. He still would have been a U.S. citizen because his mother was a U.S. citizen. Right? In the same way McCain's parents were U.S. citizens. The whole basis for was a cover for I don't like black presidents. And then, of course, there was the Tea Party movement, which was protesting Obama's tax hikes. He didn't hike our taxes, he cut our taxes. He did a tax cut. So the only way to understand what he was proposing as a tax hike was because you were intentionally misunderstanding. And it was 2008. The Tea Party movement started in 2009. We already had, to quote George Bush Jr., we already had the internet. And to quote John McCain, we already had the Googles. And all you had to do was get on the Googles, on the internet, and you could have looked up what Obama was doing. So it was an intentional ignorance, because it was just a Google search away. But it was that moment that then sparks a series of events that leads to Trump. Trump, who announces he's running for office by saying Mexicans are murderers and rapists. I'm going to build a wall, and I'm going to do a Muslim ban. He outs himself as the racist candidate. He says to the whole world, elect me and I'll make America white again. I'll make America 19th century again. He's not even trying to hide it. He's trying to carve out that space because he read the room. All good con artists can read a room. Jeb Bush is running in 2016 primaries. His performance was abysmal. At one point, he's in front of a crowd, and he says something. By the way, a paid crowd. Like you know how Putin's always accusing protesters of being paid? That's the thing that we actually do. We did that in Iran in 1953. We paid protesters to take to the streets to topple the government. Like that's actually a thing. Anyway, Jeb Bush has these paid people in the audience, and he says something, he announces something, and nobody claps. Nobody responds. He goes, "Really? That's all you got for me?" You can hear him thinking in his mind, "I'm going to ask you for my money back." And then finally somebody goes, that's how horrible his performance was. Like he wasn't even in it. I speak Spanish fluently. I'm married to a Latina. I have brown children. Vote for me. I'm the unracist Republican. Trump struck. It's a humiliating rout. And that's where I'm stopping. Probably story, but that's perfect. Then we can segue into next semester for another one. This is the last of the semester. Question. What? Barbara Bush endorsed Jeb.
Do you remember when that hit?
No, I don't remember when that
tried
hit.
to make it but everyone's eyes.
Okay, I just don't remember. The dot-com boom?
Yeah.
You mean like that
happened in the country.
that did, yeah, and it busted
Talking about the crime.
yeah. Okay, well we'll get that on the next one. Yes? I can't hear you. You're nitpicking my caller at this point? It's too late. You should have done that 2 hours ago.
but what about him?
Well, we didn't. That'll be next one. Yeah. Yes.
What if more of the technology from us going to Iraq in 2003 would be that Cheney happened to also have just been announced for Secretary of Defense under Bush Sr.'s administration right before we went into Desert Storm, the Gulf War, and then he came back as vice president and brought in.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Dick Cheney definitely wanted us to go to war. There's actually a whole thing called PNAC, Project for New American Century, and Cheney. There was a whole Condoleezza Rice, all these people that ended up in the Bush administration. They created it, I think, in '97. And they actually wrote letters to Bill Clinton telling him on how he should do foreign policy. And one of the things they kept saying was, we really want you to go to war with Iraq. And part of the project for the New American Century, the idea was we were going to create something more like a British style 21st century, and we were going to start in the Middle East. And they actually had it planned out. We were going to attack Iraq, conquer it, maybe break it up into 3 separate states, and definitely change its flag, do a lot of work on it. And then from there, we were either going to attack Syria or Iran next, conquer them, subjugate them. And then our plan was to go after Saudi Arabia, and then finally end it with Egypt. And in the process, we would completely reshape the Middle East in our own image. And a component where they were talking about how we would send in Christian missionaries to convert people. I think we wanted to recruit heavily from Korea, and then we ultimately did that in Afghanistan. We kept Korean Christian missionaries kept going to Afghanistan, getting in really big trouble. So yeah, that was a total whole thing. It was very exciting.
I know. I think like Thompson pointed out that for your 1955 policy or a 1950s policy that actually says that we're supposed to be keeping control of that region.
I mean, we actually made a deal with Saudi Arabia in the Suez Canal in January 1945, where we promised to protect the Saudi royal family all eternity. In return, the Saudis would make sure the oil. And we did this in part because of the experience we had in World War II with the Battle of the Bulge. And what happened, the nutshell version, and this will be the last thing I say, the nutshell version of what happened in World War II. The Germans attacked. They did a counterattack on the Western Front. They took all their best equipment off the Eastern Front. They packed it, their best units, and they tore us to pieces. We were melting like butter with a hot knife going through it. It was a catastrophe. And then the German military ran out of gasoline. And when they ran out of gasoline, their amazing tanks were absolutely worthless. And they got their asses kicked. And we went, oh my God, I never want to be that guy. We need to make it always flows. And so FDR flew to Egypt. He met with the king of Saudi Arabia in the Suez Canal on a ship, and we struck a deal. It is the reason why the United States and Saudi Arabia are like this to this day, right? We sometimes have spats with each other. We sometimes, but it's like two lovers do. It's our relationship, and that's never going to go away. That's permanent. That's all eternity. The fact that so many Americans really hate the Saudis is bizarre. Like, wow, what a strange villain to pick. I mean, there are so many other people on the planet to hate. It just seems really strange that the guys that ensure the flow of oil on the planet are the guys that you decided you don't want. No, I'm done. That's it. All right. Thank you so much for coming.